So Sunday night, we had the second of the presidential debates. Everyone was looking forward to it to see how would Trump respond to his first debate, how would Hillary respond to a sort of more prep Donald, and it was obvious that he had prepared, and he was significantly better than he did in the first debate. So to the extent that one can evaluate these things in sort of win or lose terms, it's hard to say that he did in fact win, unless your expectations were that he would show up like he did in the first one. So I would say that it was a draw. What was your impression of the overall debate on Sunday night?
I would agree. I think the beginning was a little rocky. I think it was probably one of the nastiest political debates that I've ever seen. But I think that, 30 minutes, halfway in, we kind of mellowed out a little bit, got more into policy discussion. And I would agree. I would say you could call it a draw. Clearly, when you look at the polls, Hillary was ahead going into it, and therefore I think that it didn't really do much for either candidate in terms of their standing with the public.
Yeah, I agree. I think they started off, it was pretty ugly. They didn't shake hands, and we'll get into that a little bit more about the body language, but they didn't shake hands. They seemed very standoffish. I remember at one point Trump, I think it was the first question from the teacher, Hillary went directly to her, looked at her, talked, and addressed her directly, whereas Trump stood off to the side. And then of course, they seemed to be circling around each other, and and there were a lot of things. Right. So what did you make of some of their opening statements? You said it was ugly to you. It seemed disjointed. What particularly stood out?
A lot. I think that strangely for me, one of the biggest moments was when he turned on the moderators. I feel like that's kind of one of the unspoken rules of debating, is that you debate your opponent, and the moderators are there to moderate. And Trump went on the offensive against Martha and Anderson about, timing, and is it my turn to talk, is it hers, and why aren't you asking her these questions? At one point, he specifically called out the emails when Martha Raddatz had just asked Hillary a question about the emails. And so I thought that was a pretty outward sign of aggression, of not even debating the person you're supposed to be debating, but also being kind of combative against the moderators.
Yeah, and it's a great lesson too. When we deal with clients, a lot of times they're being interviewed by reporters, whether it's on TV or for background information. And one of the things you have to realize is they have a job to do as well, and so they're not just your mouthpiece for whatever it is you want to say or convey. And so to get in an argument with them is probably the worst thing you could do. But let's set aside who won or lost. What seems to matter more is how each campaign deals with the aftermath of it. So what happens in the days and weeks that follow. As we saw after the first one, Trump clearly lost both the debate and that week, where he was up at 3 a.m., 5 a.m. tweeting and carrying on an issue that seemed fairly minor but became a massive issue. So, people have been calling on him not to apologize. They said, he should stand up. What was your take of it? What about Clinton? What has she done afterwards, or what do you think she should do going forward to sort of solidify what happened on Sunday night?
Yeah, well, actually, I just saw something this morning about that. Trump seems to have gone back to Twitter, which he's, I guess, not unproud of using, and is currently on the attack against Paul Ryan after the phone call yesterday where he is no longer going to defend him. And Hillary Clinton is at a rally and is, unveiling some new plan for combating poverty today. And I think that kind of is an extension of what the debate was like, where she tried to keep the conversation focused as much on policy and ideas as possible, and he went more towards addressing some of the controversies kind of around the campaign in general, both his own and hers.
Yeah, he seems sort of a Don Quixote-like figure, where he's picking fights with inanimate things, whereas the New York Times, or you're now accusing the Hillary campaign of
microphone in the last debate.
Exactly, yeah, and then as you mentioned earlier, the debate moderators, there never seems to be a consistent message or target, at least. It's scattershot, it's whoever we can pin down. And so I think that's been a big issue, and we tell clients too all the time that if you're going to be on social media, you have to be very careful how you do it, because it's reached by many people. And it's read by many people, and so you can't just go out and say whatever it is you want to say. It's real time, and worse, it can't be taken away. So it has to be, but maybe that's not what he wants to do. It seems his supporters really love that stuff. Speaking of other things and parts of the debate, we've talked about language. We've sort of talked about what happens afterwards. But one thing that was interesting, and it's become a sort of a big story, particularly on the internet, is his body language. And Hillary's too. Let's not leave her off the hook either. What was your impression of the debate, just visually? If you were to take away the sound, what was your take on that?
I think it was very visually interesting watching on TV, and I think even more so, back to the point about social media, is that these days it's not just what you see on TV and then kind of talk about. It is so easy to just grab a screenshot, and then all of a sudden it becomes a meme, and it's seen around the world. And I think that the way that the stage was set up was difficult for kind of both the candidates to figure out what that they were going to do, because they were talking to each other, they were talking to the audience, they were talking to the moderators. It was kind of awkward to sit, but then it was awkward to stand. And I think you got these really terrible shots of Donald Trump kind of lurking behind Hillary as she was talking to the audience. And whether or not he meant anything by it, it ended up with some visuals that were pretty striking. And I think that a lot of people kind of took and ran with of this is pretty intimidating and aggressive posture for him to be standing kind of lurking over her shoulder while she's talking. And sometimes you could see him, he wasn't even looking at her. Sometimes he was making a face. Sometimes he had his eyes closed. And sometimes with the split screen, like she was laughing or smiled, and people were, oh, that's not appropriate to be, she's so on her high horse that she can't even focus, and she's laughing at his response. So candidates definitely have to be much more aware of their physical presence and their body language now that A, everyone can see on TV, and then B, it can be captured and kept forever in a photograph that's circled around the internet and social media.
Yeah, I really couldn't have put it any better. And we were talking earlier about preparation, and I think that's a sign of being prepared. And it was evident whether and some people have said he perhaps intended to do that there is some psychology to pacing around the floor like that, disrupting her, getting behind her, getting close to her. But I didn't see that. To me, it spoke of just of a candidate who was truly unprepared. I mean, going back to what he said, he seemed to have 8 canned sentences or phrases that he was going to use, and he tried to insert them into anything. And much like this, he had an idea of what he was supposed to do, but really never reacted well to it. And so you saw him pacing and grimacing and grabbing onto the chair, and then the sniffling again. Apparently,
Yep.
I don't know how many times they did it. I'm sure someone's come out with a meme of it since, but I'm sure there were a lot more of it. So one thing that's sort of been we've sort of discussed, and it's been discussed since this debate, is Trump has gone off sort of the deep end, and I think it's evident to anybody who's watched him. He's now attacking both his own party and the Clintons. And the question is he going to actually win this with this path? Like, he's attracting only his voters, it seems, at this point. I mean, he's really giving them the meat that they want rather than expanding. What more? I mean, if you were advising him, what would you tell him differently?
A lot.
Yeah.
And I think that people have made this point over and over of he won the primary by appealing to this group of voters that he's been appealing to. And anyone who kind of could do the math was saying this isn't really a sustainable way to win if this is the only people you're appealing to and you're not expanding that group anymore. And I think that, like you said, his debate performance and the things that he's saying on social media and the things he's saying, to the press are aimed at that core group of voters and his supporters that are already voting for him. And he's doing nothing to expand past that. And if you look at the numbers, it's not there. It's not enough for him to win over enough people. He's, they talk about the people that he's insulted and the people that he's said offensive things about, and that's a huge part of the American electorate at large. And he is alienating these people and doing nothing to try and bring them back into the fold. And so, sure, the people who are voting for him are going to vote for him, but if he doesn't expand that any further, then it's going to be, mathematically impossible for him to get enough electoral votes to win.
No, and I think that's absolutely right. I was prepared to come in here and say the polls won't change much. I was expecting probably a 1% to 2% bump for him, but many of the recent polls we've seen, and they were all pre-taped, so let's put that caveat in there, that meaning they were fielded before the Access Hollywood tape that leaked last Friday. But he was losing in nearly all of them, and and they've still not accounted for that video. So he's losing in the 9 polls that have come out since, and that doesn't account for the video. And I think you're absolutely right. He's appealing to one group, and I think he's reached this ceiling, this hard ceiling of maybe 40 to 42% of the vote. And this is bad news because he can't really afford any negative shock, given that he entered Friday in a bad position to begin with. And let's say the tape only hurts him by maybe one percentage point, bringing him to a 6-point deficit from 5-point deficit. That's still massive, and I just can't see this current line of attack and of messaging appealing to a broader base.
Yeah. Well, I would say I think that the only strategy that maybe he has is not to necessarily expand his voter base, but to diminish Hillary Clinton's voter base. And by continuing to go on the attack and attack the Clintons and Hillary, of that convincing people to either not vote for her, maybe to vote third party, or to not vote at all, to stay home, to say, I'm not touching this election. And all of that helps him because if he can just get her voter base smaller than his, then he can still win. So I think that that's kind of his only viable strategy left because he doesn't seem to be interested in expanding his base when you maybe insult 51% of the population.
No, I there was a great 538 did a mock map the other day and said if all women decided not to vote for Trump, Hillary would win in a landslide and it would be hysterical. But I do think you're right. We so often we work for brands or issues that have a targeted group, but within that is still this understanding that you can't offend all the other people that because eventually you have to have a wider acceptance. You have to have you want everybody on your side, and in this case, that's just not going to work. So we'll see what happens in the next week, next 2 weeks. Next debate is October 19th. Do you have any? Are you hoping to see anything between now and then, or?
I think it'll just be interesting to see kind of do the candidates continue in this direction? Do they continue to either focus on policy or attack? How. I think a lot of people were talking about that this was kind of the lowest of the low, and I hope so. I hope that we hit our low point and that maybe we'll have something a little bit more, substantive in the weeks to come, but we'll see.
I agree, so we'll see. Come back on October 19th.